At 62, Margaret Collins had learned that grief did not always arrive with tears. Sometimes it arrived quietly. Sometimes it looked like an empty chair at the kitchen table. Sometimes it sounded like the refrigerator humming in a house that had suddenly become too large. And sometimes it came in the voice of your own son when he said, "Mom, I'm choosing my wife." Margaret would remember those words for the rest of her life. She had been standing in the living room that evening, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows of the small suburban house she had shared with her husband, Daniel, for more than 3 decades. Daniel had been gone for 11 months. 11 months since the doctors had told them there was nothing more they could do. 11 months since Margaret had sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand while he struggled to breathe. 11 months since he had looked at her and whispered, "Take care of yourself, Maggie." She had promised him she would. She just hadn't expected that taking care of herself would eventually mean standing alone against the people she loved most. That evening, her son Ethan stood across from her. He was 35, tall like his father, with the same dark eyes that had once looked at Margaret with complete trust. Beside him stood his wife, Victoria. Neither of them had sat down. Margaret noticed that immediately. Ethan usually came into the house, kissed her cheek, opened the refrigerator, and complained jokingly that she never kept enough food in it. That was the Ethan she knew. The Ethan who had once fallen asleep on her shoulder during a long car ride. The Ethan she had stayed awake with when he was sick as a child. The Ethan whose college tuition she and Daniel had saved for years to help pay. The Ethan who had called her every Sunday after Daniel died, because he was afraid she was lonely. That Ethan seemed to have disappeared. Or perhaps Margaret had simply been too afraid to notice that he was changing. She put the cup down. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Ethan looked at Victoria. It was a small movement, almost nothing. But Margaret saw it. He was looking to his wife for reassurance before answering his mother. Victoria nodded slightly. Ethan took a breath. "Mom, we need to talk." Margaret tried to smile. "Of course." She pointed toward the sofa. "Sit down. I'll make some coffee." "No." The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Margaret froze. Victoria folded her arms. "We don't want to stay long," she said. Margaret looked from one face to the other. "All right." Ethan rubbed his palms together. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then he said, "Things haven't been working between us." Margaret frowned. "What things?" "You and Victoria." Margaret's expression changed. "I thought we were getting along." Victoria gave a quiet laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. That somehow made it hurt more. "That's exactly the problem," Victoria said. "You don't see it." Margaret looked at her. "I don't understand. You don't respect boundaries." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. "I've never asked either of you to live your life the way I want." "You don't have to say it directly," Victoria replied. "It's the way you react. Every time Ethan makes a decision, you question it. Every time we do something differently from the way you and Daniel did things, you have something to say." Margaret shook her head. "I've never told Ethan how to run his marriage." Ethan finally spoke. "Mom, that's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" He looked down. Margaret waited. She had spent most of her life waiting for Ethan to find the right words. When he was 6, he would stand outside the kitchen while she cooked and struggle to explain why he had broken a lamp. When he was 16, he had sat in the same room and confessed that he had wrecked his father's car. When he was 22, he had called her from college and admitted that he wasn't sure he wanted the career he had spent 4 years preparing for. She had always listened. She had always told him the same thing. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's really your decision." Now looking at him, she wondered if he remembered those words. Ethan finally raised his eyes. "I need you to stop getting involved in our financial decisions." Margaret stared at him. "I don't get involved. You've talked to me about the house. Because you asked me whether you should refinance it. That was months ago. And I gave you my opinion because you asked." Victoria interrupted. "You also told him not to move his savings." Margaret turned toward her. "Because Ethan told me he was considering putting everything into a business investment he didn't fully understand. That was our decision," Victoria said. I know. Then why did you have to question it? Margaret took a slow breath. Because I'm his mother. The room went silent. For a moment, Margaret thought she saw something soften in Ethan's expression. Then it disappeared. I'm not a child anymore, Mom. I know you're not. Then treat me like an adult. I am. No, Ethan said. You treat me like someone who needs to be protected from every decision I make. Margaret felt tears forming, but she refused to let them fall. I've never wanted to control you. Victoria stepped closer to Ethan. You may not mean to, Margaret, but that's what happens. Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law. There was something in Victoria's expression that troubled her. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. The certainty of someone who had already decided what another person was guilty of. Margaret looked back at her son. Ethan, if I've crossed a line, tell me. I'll listen. I have told you. No. You told me I'm interfering. I'm asking you to tell me what I did. Ethan didn't answer. Victoria did. You keep asking about Daniel's estate. Margaret's heart sank. There it was. The real subject. Daniel's estate. After his death, Margaret had handled everything carefully. There had been a modest investment account, the house, some retirement savings, and a few assets connected to Daniel's consulting business. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that made them wealthy. But there was enough to matter. Enough that Margaret had noticed a change in people's behavior after Daniel died. People who had rarely asked about money suddenly became curious. Relatives wanted to know what Daniel had left. Acquaintances asked whether Margaret planned to sell the house. Even Ethan had once asked what would happen to everything when she was gone. At the time, Margaret hadn't thought much of it. Now she understood why Victoria had brought it up. I haven't hidden anything from Ethan, Margaret said. Victoria shook her head. You've never given him a clear answer. Because there isn't anything he needs to decide right now. That isn't your decision. No, Margaret said quietly. It isn't. Ethan looked uncomfortable. Mom, Victoria and I are trying to plan our future. I understand. We need financial clarity. Margaret nodded. I understand that too. Then I need you to sign something. He reached into a folder. Margaret looked at it but didn't touch it. What is it? It's just a document giving me more authority over some of the family assets. Margaret looked at him. Which assets? Some of Dad's investments. Why? So I can manage them. You already have access to the information you need. That's not the point. Margaret picked up the folder. She read the first page. Then the second. Her hands became still. The language was complicated, but not complicated enough to hide the purpose. It would give Ethan control over assets that Margaret currently managed. Margaret looked at her son. Who prepared this? A lawyer. Which lawyer? Someone Victoria knows. Margaret slowly closed the folder. I won't sign this tonight. Ethan's jaw tightened. Why? Because I haven't had my own attorney review it. Victoria Said. Of course. Margaret looked at her. What does that mean? It means you always assume someone is trying to take something from you. Margaret shook her head. No. It means I don't sign legal documents without understanding them. Ethan stepped back. Fine. His voice had changed. It wasn't the voice of a son speaking to his mother anymore. It was the voice of someone who had already made a decision. Then maybe we need some distance. Margaret stared at him. Distance? Yes. How much? Ethan swallowed. I'm not sure. Victoria reached for his hand. Margaret watched them. Two people she loved standing together. And somehow she was the outsider. Then Ethan said the sentence that broke something inside her. I'm choosing my wife, Mom. Margaret didn't respond. She couldn't. The rain continued tapping against the windows. The house seemed impossibly quiet. Ethan picked up his coat. Victoria followed him toward the door. Just before leaving, Ethan turned around. For one brief moment, Margaret saw the little boy who used to run into her arms. Then he was gone. Please don't make this harder than it has to be, he said. Margaret nodded. I won't. The door closed. She remained standing in the living room. A minute passed. Then another. Finally, Margaret walked to the kitchen and sat at the table where Daniel had eaten breakfast every morning for 38 years. She looked at his empty chair. 4 months after his death, she had avoided sitting there. Tonight she finally did. Her hands trembled as she opened the folder Ethan had left behind. She read the documents again. Then she stood, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled down an old wooden box. It was covered in dust. Inside were Daniel's personal papers. At the bottom was a sealed envelope with Margaret's name written in his handwriting. She had never opened it. Daniel had given it to her 3 weeks before he died. He had told her only one thing. Keep this somewhere safe. If Ethan ever comes to you asking for something you don't understand, read it first. Margaret had promised. Now she sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of her. Her husband's handwriting looked exactly as she remembered it. She ran her fingers across the paper. For 11 months, she had been afraid to open it. Tonight, she finally broke the seal. And as she read the first few lines, Margaret realized that Daniel had known something she never did. Something about their son. Something about the future. Something that could explain why Ethan was suddenly willing to choose his wife over his own mother. Margaret read the letter once. Then again. And when she reached the final paragraph, she closed her eyes. Daniel had written, "Maggie, if this day ever comes, don't fight Ethan. Don't beg him to believe you. Let him make his own choice. The truth will eventually find him." Margaret sat alone in the quiet kitchen. For the first time that night, she stopped crying. She folded the letter carefully. Then she whispered to the empty chair across from her, "Daniel, what did you know?" Margaret did not sleep that night. She stayed at the kitchen table long after midnight. Daniel's letter resting beneath her hand. She had read it so many times that the words were beginning to blur. Not because they were difficult to understand. Because they were frighteningly simple. Daniel had known there might come a day when Ethan would believe that his mother was standing between him and his future. He had known Margaret might be accused of controlling money. And most troubling of all, he had known that someone might try to convince Ethan that protecting his marriage required cutting his mother out of his life. But Daniel had not written a name. He had not accused Victoria. He had not even accused Ethan. That was what made the letter so difficult. Daniel had never been a man who made accusations without evidence. For 38 years, Margaret had watched him approach problems the same way. He listened first. He asked questions. He kept records. And when something did not make sense, he never rushed to conclusions. Margaret had always admired that about him. Now she wished he were sitting across from her so she could ask what he had been thinking. She picked up the letter again. There was one sentence she had not fully understood. "If Ethan ever comes to you asking for something you don't understand, read this first." He had written that before he became seriously ill. At the time, Margaret had assumed he was simply organizing his affairs. Daniel had always been practical. Even during the final months of his life, he had insisted on keeping his paperwork in order. He had made lists. He had updated insurance information. He had reviewed the mortgage. He had spoken with his attorney. Margaret had hated those conversations because they made his illness feel real. She remembered sitting beside him one afternoon while he sorted through a stack of documents. "Do we really have to do this now?" she had asked. Daniel had looked at her and smiled. "Yes. You're not going anywhere." He had paused. Then he had said gently, "Maggie, none of us gets to make that promise." She had walked away because she couldn't bear to hear it. Now she wished she had stayed. At 6 in the morning, Margaret finally went upstairs. She showered, dressed, and made coffee. Her routine was almost identical to every other morning. That was important to her. She refused to let one painful conversation destroy the structure of her life. At 8:30, she called the attorney who had handled Daniel's estate. His name was Robert Hayes. He had worked with Daniel for nearly 15 years. Margaret had spoken to him several times after Daniel's death, but she had not contacted him since the estate was settled. Robert answered on the third ring. "Margaret. Robert." There was a pause. "Is everything okay?" "I don't know." That answer made him sit up. "What happened?" Margaret took a breath. "Ethan came over last night." Robert was silent. "What does he want?" "He brought me documents." "What kind?" He wants me to give him control over some of the assets Daniel left. Robert did not immediately answer. Did you sign anything? No. Good. The firmness in his voice surprised her. Why? Because I don't want you signing anything until we review it together. Margaret looked toward the window. I thought everything was already settled. Most of it is. Most. Robert paused. Margaret, did Ethan mention Daniel's trust? Her fingers tightened around the coffee mug. No. Did Victoria? No. Another pause. Then don't discuss it with either of them yet. Margaret's heart began beating faster. What trust? Robert exhaled. I think we need to meet in person. Robert, please. She heard the hesitation in his voice. I need to understand what my husband did. You will. When? I can see you this afternoon. Margaret agreed. After hanging up, she sat quietly for several minutes. She wanted to call Ethan. Every instinct told her to call him, to ask him to come back, to tell him she wasn't trying to control him, to remind him that she was his mother. But she remembered Daniel's words. Don't fight Ethan. Don't beg him to believe you. Let him make his own choice. The hardest thing Margaret had ever learned about motherhood was that sometimes love required restraint. She put down the phone. She would wait. Around 10, Ethan called. Margaret almost didn't answer, but she did. Hello. Mom. His voice sounded tired. Ian. There was a long pause. I wanted to apologize for last night. Margaret closed her eyes. Thank you. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know. I just feel like you don't trust me. That isn't true. It feels true. Margaret swallowed. Ethan, I trust you to make your own decisions. Then why won't you sign the documents? Because trusting you doesn't mean I have to sign something I haven't had reviewed. He became quiet. Victoria thinks you're doing this on purpose. I know. She thinks you're trying to keep control of everything. I know. And honestly, sometimes I wonder if she's right. Those words hurt more than anything he had said the night before. But Margaret remained calm. Ethan, if you believe I'm doing something wrong, ask me about it. I am asking. No. You're asking me to prove that I'm innocent. He didn't respond. Margaret continued. That's different. I don't want to fight with you. Neither do I. Then please just give us what we need. Margaret looked down at Daniel's letter. What do you think you need? There was a pause. Control over the assets. Why? Because they're part of my future. Margaret's voice softened. Ethan, your future is not a bank account. He sighed. That's exactly what Victoria means. What? She says you use money to control people. Margaret felt the words settle heavily inside her. Do you believe that? I don't know anymore. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret said quietly, if you believe that about me, I won't try to convince you otherwise today. Mom. But I won't sign anything under pressure. Another silence. Okay. The call ended. Margaret sat still. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was grieving. Not the loss of her husband. She had already learned how to live with that. She was grieving the loss of certainty about her son. At 2 that afternoon, Margaret drove to Robert Hayes's office. She had been there many times with Daniel. The building looked exactly as she remembered it. Robert met her in the lobby and led her into a conference room. He closed the door. Then he placed a thick file on the table. Margaret stared at it. What's in there? Daniel's estate documents. I thought those were finished. They were. Then why are we looking at them again? Robert sat across from her. Because there was one part Daniel wanted kept separate. Margaret felt a chill move through her. Why? Robert folded his hands. Because he was concerned about Ethan's ability to make financial decisions under pressure. Margaret frowned. That doesn't sound like Daniel. It was not a judgment against Ethan. Then what was it? Robert looked directly at her. Protection. He opened the file. Inside were documents Margaret had never seen. Robert explained that shortly before Daniel's death, he had established a separate trust arrangement involving certain investments and assets. Margaret listened carefully. The structure was complicated, but the basic idea was clear. Ethan would eventually benefit from the assets. But he would not have unrestricted control over all of them immediately. There were safeguards, independent legal review, financial advice, specific conditions designed to prevent the assets from being transferred impulsively or under pressure. Margaret stared at Robert. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel instructed me not to unless it became necessary. Necessary? Robert nodded. He specifically said that if Ethan ever attempted to change the arrangement before receiving independent advice, I was supposed to contact you. Margaret looked down. And now he has. Not exactly. What do you mean? Robert turned the document toward her. This is what Ethan's attorney sent us. Margaret read the page. Her stomach tightened. The document Ethan had brought her wasn't simply about managing the assets. It would effectively alter how certain inherited property was controlled. Margaret looked up. Why would he want this? Robert answered carefully. I don't know. Do you think Victoria knows about the trust? I can't speculate. Margaret nodded. She appreciated that. Robert never said more than he could prove. Then he opened another file. This is where things become important. Inside was correspondence from several months earlier. Robert pointed to a date. Victoria contacted my office. Margaret looked at him. About what? She wanted information about Ethan's inheritance. Margaret's expression changed. What did she ask? She asked whether Ethan could transfer part of his future interest into an account that she and Ethan would control jointly. Margaret stared at the page. Did she say why? She said they were planning their financial future. That doesn't sound illegal. It isn't. Robert's tone remained calm. But because of the trust structure, I told her Ethan would need independent advice before making any changes. Margaret nodded slowly. Did Ethan know she contacted you? I don't know. Did you tell him? I couldn't. She wasn't authorized to speak on his behalf. Margaret leaned back. For the first time, she began to see the situation differently. Maybe Victoria wasn't trying to steal anything. Maybe she simply wanted greater financial security. Maybe Ethan believed his mother was blocking that security. Maybe nobody was entirely innocent. And perhaps that was what made everything so dangerous. Because family conflicts rarely begin with someone announcing that they intend to hurt another person. They begin with assumptions. With conversations that happen behind closed doors. With small resentments that grow because nobody asks the right questions. Margaret looked at Robert. Can Ethan lose his inheritance? Not under the current arrangement. Can Victoria control it? Not without Ethan making certain changes himself. Margaret nodded. And if he signs what they brought me? Robert paused. That could create complications. What kind? I'd rather have your own attorney review the exact document before giving you a definitive answer. Margaret almost smiled. Daniel would have said the same thing. Robert smiled faintly. He usually did. For a moment, the room felt lighter. Then Margaret remembered something. Robert. Yes. Why did Daniel leave me that letter? Robert looked at her for a long moment. I don't know. You knew he wrote it? Yes. You knew about the trust? Yes. And you never told me? Daniel asked me not to. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. What was he afraid of? Robert closed the file. I don't think he was afraid of Ethan. Then who? I don't know. Margaret looked toward the window. Outside, people walked along the sidewalk, carrying coffee, talking on phones, living ordinary lives. She wished hers were ordinary again. But something had changed. She was beginning to understand that Daniel had not left behind a secret fortune. He had left behind a plan designed to protect their son, and possibly a warning about what could happen if Ethan stopped thinking for himself. When Margaret returned home, she found a message waiting on her phone. It was from Ethan. Mom, Victoria and I are meeting with our attorney tomorrow. We need you to cooperate. If you refuse, things are going to get complicated. Asterisk asterisk. Margaret read it twice. She did not reply immediately. Instead, she walked into the bedroom and opened Daniel's wooden box. The letter was still there. She unfolded it again. This time, she noticed something she had missed the night before. At the bottom of the page, beneath Daniel's signature, there was a handwritten sentence. Only 6 words. Trust Robert. He knows the whole story. Margaret stared at those words. Then she reached for the phone. She called Robert. He answered almost immediately. Margaret, I found something in Daniel's letter. What? He wrote that you know the whole story. Silence. Not the brief silence of someone thinking. A longer one. The kind that told Margaret there was something Robert had been carrying for a very long time. Finally, he said, Margaret, I think it's time you knew what Daniel discovered before he died. Her heart began to pound. What did he discover? Robert took a slow breath. I can't tell you over the phone. Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed. Then tell me when I see you. I will. When? Tomorrow morning. Margaret looked at the photograph of Daniel on the dresser. For 11 months, she had believed her husband's final days were defined by illness. Now she wondered if there had been something else. Something he had known. Something he had chosen not to tell her. And perhaps the most painful truth of all was that Ethan's betrayal might not have started with Victoria. It might have started long before Ethan ever met her. Margaret looked again at the message from her son. She typed a response. Then stopped. She deleted it. There was no point arguing through a phone. Tomorrow, she would hear the truth. And for the first time since Daniel died, Margaret felt something other than grief. She felt afraid. Not of losing money. Not of losing her house. Not even of losing Ethan. She was afraid of discovering that the man she had loved for 38 years had carried a secret so serious that he believed their son could one day turn against her because of it. She placed the phone on the table. Then she whispered to the empty room. Daniel, whatever you knew, I hope you were wrong. But deep inside, Margaret already suspected he wasn't. The next morning, Margaret arrived at Robert Hayes's office 15 minutes early. She had barely slept. All night, she had replayed the previous evening in her mind. The way Ethan had stood beside Victoria, the folder of legal documents in his hand, and the sentence that had cut deeper than anything else. I'm choosing my wife, Mom. She had tried to tell herself that Ethan was simply angry, that he was under pressure, that perhaps Victoria had influenced him. But Robert's warning had changed the way she looked at everything. There was a difference between a son being angry with his mother and a son being prepared to change the legal structure of his father's estate. One was emotional. The other could have consequences that lasted for decades. Margaret sat in the waiting area, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When Robert came out, he looked more serious than usual. Come in, he said. Margaret followed him into the conference room. She closed the door behind her. You said Daniel discovered something before he died. Robert nodded. I did. Margaret sat down. Please tell me. Robert remained standing for a moment. Then he took a seat across from her. Before I do, I want you to understand something. Daniel never asked me to protect you from Ethan. Margaret frowned. What did he ask you to do? Protect Ethan from making a decision he couldn't undo. She looked down at the table. Because of Victoria? I don't know. Then because of whom? Robert opened a folder. Because Daniel believed Ethan had become increasingly dependent on other people's opinions when making financial decisions. Margaret's expression tightened. That sounds like my son. Robert nodded. He wasn't accusing Ethan of being weak. He was concerned that Ethan sometimes confused keeping the peace with making the right decision. Margaret thought about the previous night. That sounded exactly like what had happened. Ethan had not asked questions. He had chosen a side. Robert continued. About 2 years before Daniel died, Ethan approached him about taking money from one of the family investments to start a business with a friend. Margaret remembered. She had forgotten the details, but she remembered Daniel being unusually cautious. He told me Ethan wanted to start a restaurant, she said. Yes. He didn't approve. Not immediately. Robert opened another document. Daniel asked Ethan to provide a business plan, financial projections, and an agreement outlining what would happen if the partnership failed. Margaret smiled faintly. That sounds like Daniel. It was. What happened? The partnership never moved forward. Why? Ethan's friend changed his mind. Margaret nodded. She remembered how disappointed Ethan had been. But Robert wasn't finished. Several months later, Ethan wanted to invest in another opportunity. Margaret frowned. What opportunity? A private real estate deal. Her face changed. I remember that. You advised him not to do it? Daniel did. Exactly. Margaret leaned back. So Daniel's concern wasn't about Victoria? No. Then what was he afraid of? Robert folded his hands. Daniel was afraid that Ethan would eventually make a major financial decision, because someone he trusted told him it was the right thing to do. Margaret stared at him. That doesn't sound like a secret. It isn't. Robert paused. What Daniel discovered later was more concerning. Margaret waited. Ethan had already been discussing financial decisions with someone outside the family. Who? Robert looked directly at her. Victoria. Margaret's heart sank. But they weren't married yet. No. When was this? About 8 months before their wedding. Margaret said nothing. Robert explained that Ethan had been considering a large investment. Victoria had encouraged him to move forward. Daniel had not opposed the relationship. He had opposed the financial decision. That distinction mattered. But Ethan had interpreted his father's concern differently. He thought Daniel didn't trust Victoria, Margaret said. Yes. And Victoria knew that. Yes. Margaret looked away. Suddenly, pieces of old conversations came back to her. Victoria saying that Daniel was too cautious. Ethan saying his father didn't understand the new economy. Daniel becoming quieter whenever the subject came up. Margaret had assumed it was ordinary disagreement. She had never imagined it would become important after his death. Did Daniel confront Victoria? No. Why not? Because he didn't want to create a conflict between Ethan and the woman he intended to marry. Margaret closed her eyes. That sounds like him too. Robert slid another document across the table. This is the part you need to understand. Margaret looked down. It was a written note from Daniel. Not a legal document. Not a contract. Just several paragraphs in his handwriting. Robert said, Daniel wrote this after his final meeting with me. Margaret picked it up. Her hands trembled. She read slowly. Daniel wrote that he loved Ethan and trusted him to build his own life. But he also admitted that he had become concerned about how quickly Ethan changed his decisions when confronted by people he wanted to please. He didn't blame Victoria. He didn't blame Ethan. He blamed himself for never teaching his son that disagreement did not mean rejection. Margaret stopped reading. A tear fell onto the page. That sounds like Daniel. Robert nodded. He also wrote something else. Margaret looked up. What? He said that if he died before Ethan learned to separate loyalty from judgment, you might become the person Ethan blamed for every financial restriction. Margaret swallowed. Why me? Because you would be the one managing the trust. She looked down again. Suddenly everything made sense. The legal structure. The safeguards. The documents Ethan had brought her. The anger. The accusations. It wasn't about Margaret controlling Ethan. It was about Ethan believing that his mother stood between him and the life he wanted. Robert continued. Daniel expected that possibility. Margaret looked at him. Did he know Victoria would be involved? No. Are you sure? Yes. Then why did he write about someone influencing Ethan? Because he had already seen it happen. Margaret sat quietly. She wanted to be angry. At Victoria. At Ethan. At Daniel for leaving her with this burden. But mostly she felt tired. Robert, she said quietly. What exactly does Ethan want me to sign? Robert reached for the copy of the document. It would give him direct authority over several assets that are currently protected under the estate arrangement. Could he sell them? Potentially. Transfer them? Potentially. Move the money? Depending on the asset, yes. Margaret stared at the document. And Victoria? Robert hesitated. Her name isn't on the document. Margaret looked relieved for half a second. But there is a separate financial agreement between Ethan and Victoria. What kind? A marital property agreement. Margaret frowned. Prenuptial agreement? No. They married without one. Then what? Postnuptial agreement. Margaret had never heard Ethan mention it. When did they sign it? About 6 months after their wedding. Why? I don't know. What does it say? I can't discuss Victoria's private legal documents with you. Margaret nodded. That's fair. But I can tell you one thing. What? The document Ethan wants you to sign could affect assets that may be relevant to their marital finances. Margaret looked at him. So Victoria may have a financial interest. Possibly. Does Ethan know that? I assume so. Margaret thought about the way Ethan had spoken. He had genuinely believed he was protecting his wife. That made everything more complicated. If Victoria had convinced him that his mother was withholding money that belonged to him, Ethan might not think he was betraying Margaret. He might think he was standing up for his family. Margaret looked at the clock. What happens if I refuse? Robert answered immediately. You have every right to refuse until you've obtained independent legal advice. And if Ethan sues me? Then you respond through counsel. Margaret nodded. What if he stops speaking to me? Robert looked at her carefully. That is not a legal question. I know. You need to decide what you're willing to sacrifice to protect the assets. Margaret smiled sadly. I've already sacrificed my relationship with my son. You don't know that yet. She looked at him. Last night he told me he was choosing his wife. Robert leaned back. People say things when they're angry. He wasn't angry. What was he? Margaret thought for a moment. Certain. Robert didn't respond. That word stayed in the room. Certain. The problem wasn't that Ethan was confused. He believed he understood the situation. And Margaret knew how difficult it was to change someone's mind once they believed they were acting morally. After leaving Robert's office, Margaret drove home. She stopped at a grocery store on the way. She bought milk, bread, apples, and coffee. Ordinary things. She wanted something ordinary. At home, she put the groceries away. Then her phone rang. Ethan. She answered. Mom, where are you? Home. I need you to come over. Why? Victoria and I are meeting with our attorney this afternoon. Margaret's stomach tightened. What do you need from me? We want to resolve this without making it a legal issue. Margaret sat down. Ethan, I haven't done anything wrong. I know you think that. That isn't what I said. He sighed. Mom, we're not asking for anything unreasonable. You brought me documents I didn't understand. Our attorney explained them. Your attorney isn't my attorney. Why does everything have to be so difficult? Margaret closed her eyes. Because these are legal documents. Dad would have trusted me. Margaret went silent. That sentence hurt. Not because it was true. Because Ethan knew exactly what it would do to her. Don't use your father to pressure me, she said quietly. I didn't. You did. I just want what Dad intended for me. Margaret looked toward the photograph on the mantel. Your father intended for you to have a future. Exactly. He also intended you to make your own decisions. I am. Are you? Silence. Margaret immediately regretted asking. Ethan's voice became colder. I can't keep doing this. Neither can I. So sign the documents. No. The word came out calmly. Firmly. Ethan breathed heavily. Then I don't know what else to say. You don't have to say anything. Fine. He hung up. Margaret stared at the phone. Her hands were shaking. She placed it on the table. Then someone knocked on the front door. Margaret stood. When she opened it, Victoria was standing there alone. Margaret was surprised. Victoria. We need to talk. Margaret stepped aside. Come. Victoria walked into the living room but didn't sit. For several seconds she looked around the house. Her eyes stopped on the photograph of Daniel. I miss him, she said. Margaret's expression softened. So do I. Victoria looked at her. I know you think I'm doing this because of money. Margaret didn't answer. I'm not. Then tell me what this is about. Victoria folded her hands. Ethan is scared. Of what? Of losing everything. Margaret frowned. Why would he? Because your husband left things complicated. Daniel didn't leave things complicated. Victoria looked at her. He left Ethan with an inheritance he can't fully control. Margaret said nothing. Victoria continued. That makes Ethan feel like he has no control over his own future. Margaret considered her words. Then why didn't he tell me that? Because he knows you'll say no. To what? Victoria hesitated. To changes we want to make. Margaret watched her carefully. What changes? Victoria looked away. Financial changes. There it was again. The same vague language. Margaret remained calm. Victoria, I don't want to fight with you. Neither do I. Then tell me the truth. Victoria looked back at her. For the first time, Margaret saw something beneath her confidence. Fear. Not greed. Not anger. Fear. I'm pregnant, Victoria said. Margaret froze. The room seemed to go completely silent. You're what? I'm pregnant. Margaret stared at her. How far along? Almost 12 weeks. 1,000 emotions crossed Margaret's face. Shock, joy, confusion, then something else. Hope. She stepped closer. Why didn't Ethan tell me? He wanted to. Then why didn't he? Because everything between you two has become so difficult. Margaret felt tears rise again. A baby changes nothing about how much I love my son. I know. And it changes nothing about what I will or won't sign. Victoria nodded. I know that too. For a moment, they simply stood there. Then Victoria said something Margaret wasn't expecting. I need you to understand that I'm not trying to take Ethan away from you. Margaret looked into her eyes. Then don't. Victoria looked down. I don't know how to fix this. Margaret's voice softened. Neither do I. Victoria wiped her eyes. I wish Daniel were here. So do I. She turned toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped. Margaret. Yes. Ethan thinks your refusal means you don't trust him. Margaret looked at her. I trust my son. Then why won't you give him what he wants? Margaret took a breath. Because sometimes loving someone means refusing to give them something simply because they are certain they want it. Victoria didn't respond. She opened the door. Then she looked back. I hope you're right. Margaret watched her leave. She closed the door slowly. For the first time, she understood that the conflict was no longer only between a mother and her son. There was an unborn child involved now. And that made every decision more serious. Margaret walked to the mantel and picked up Daniel's photograph. You knew, she whispered. Not about the pregnancy. About the conflict. About Ethan. About the possibility that one day his desire to protect his own family might make him turn against the person who had spent her entire life protecting him. Her phone vibrated. A message from Robert. I reviewed the documents again. There is something you need to know before Ethan's meeting this afternoon. Asterisk asterisk. Margaret stared at the screen. A second message appeared. Daniel left one final instruction. It concerns Ethan's inheritance, and the reason he created the trust in the first place. Asterisk asterisk. Margaret sat down. She had thought she was finally beginning to understand the truth. Now she realized she had only reached the beginning. And somewhere across town, Ethan was preparing to sit in a lawyer's office with his wife, believing his mother was standing in the way of his family's future. He still didn't know what his father had discovered. He didn't know what Daniel had protected. And most importantly, he didn't know that the decision he was about to make could change his relationship with his mother forever. Margaret read Robert's message 3 times before she called him. He answered almost immediately. Did you get my message? Yes. You should come to my office. Before Ethan's meeting? Yes. Margaret glanced at the clock. She had less than 2 hours. I'll be there. She grabbed her purse and keys. As she drove across town, she tried to keep her thoughts organized. Daniel had left a trust. He had left a letter. He had warned Robert about a possible conflict. And now Robert was telling her that Daniel had left one final instruction concerning Ethan's inheritance. But Margaret refused to let fear make decisions for her. She had learned one thing from Daniel over the years. When something felt confusing, slow down. So she did. She arrived at Robert's office and found him waiting. He closed the door behind her. "This isn't going to be easy," he said. Margaret sat down. "Tell me anyway." Robert opened a thin folder. Daniel changed the trust instructions about 6 months before he died. Margaret looked at him. Why? Because he learned something about Ethan's financial situation. What? Robert slid a document across the table. Ethan had significant personal debt. Margaret stared at the page. How much? About $180,000. Her face went pale. That can't be right. It was. Credit cards. Partly. A personal loan. Some business-related debt. And several large expenses that had been put on credit. Margaret looked down. Why didn't he tell me? I don't know. Did Daniel know? Yes. And he didn't tell me either? Robert shook his head. Daniel believed Ethan needed to take responsibility for his own finances. Margaret closed her eyes. She remembered the last year before Daniel died. Ethan had seemed stressed. He had canceled family dinners. He had complained about work. Once, Daniel had asked him if everything was okay. Ethan had said yes. Margaret had believed him. Now she wondered how much her husband had known. Robert continued. Daniel didn't want Ethan to receive a large amount of unrestricted money, while he was already under financial pressure. So he created the trust. Yes. And he appointed me. Yes. Why me? Because Daniel trusted you to make decisions based on Ethan's long-term interests rather than his immediate demands. Margaret looked away. I don't want that responsibility. I know. Then why didn't he choose someone else? Because he knew you. That answer hurt. Not because it was wrong. Because it was exactly what Daniel would have said. Margaret picked up the document. What was his final instruction? Robert pointed to a paragraph. If Ethan requests control of the protected assets before completing independent financial counseling, the trustee is instructed to delay the transfer. Margaret read it carefully. Financial counseling? Yes. What does that mean? Ethan would meet with an independent financial advisor. The advisor would review his debt, income, expenses, and the proposed use of the assets. And then, if the advisor determines that the transfer is reasonable, the trust can be reviewed. Margaret nodded slowly. So I'm not blocking him. No. The trust is. More accurately, the conditions Daniel established are. Margaret looked at the page again. Does Ethan know this? Not fully. Why not? Because Daniel's instructions were designed to be explained when the conditions were triggered. Margaret felt frustrated. Then why has nobody explained this to him? Robert gave her a serious look. Because until now, Ethan hadn't formally requested the transfer. Margaret understood. The moment had arrived. She looked at her watch. I have to stop them. Robert shook his head. No. She looked at him. You just told me he doesn't know. I said you don't need to stop the meeting. Then what should I do? Let Ethan hear the truth. Margaret hesitated. Robert continued. Don't accuse Victoria. Don't accuse Ethan. Don't bring up everything you've learned about their finances. Why? Because if you turn this into a fight between you and Victoria, Ethan will probably defend her again. Margaret knew he was right. She had spent too much time trying to prove that Victoria was wrong. That was not going to solve anything. What should I say? The truth. Margaret nodded. I can do that. Robert handed her a copy of Daniel's instruction. Take this with you. She stood. Before leaving, she stopped. Robert. Yes. Was Daniel afraid of Victoria? Robert thought for a moment. No. Was he afraid of Ethan? No. Then what was he afraid of? Robert answered quietly. He was afraid that Ethan would make a permanent decision while trying to solve a temporary problem. Margaret carried those words with her as she left. When she arrived at the law office where Ethan was meeting with his attorney, she almost turned around. She didn't want another confrontation. She wanted her son back. But she knew running away would not solve anything. She walked inside. The receptionist informed her that Ethan and Victoria were already in a conference room. Margaret waited. A few minutes later, the door opened. Ethan looked surprised. "Mom, I need to talk to you." Victoria stood behind him. Her expression immediately became guarded. Ethan glanced at his attorney, then back at Margaret. "Why are you here?" "Because I was asked to explain something about Dad's estate." Ethan's face tightened. "I don't want another argument." "Neither do I." He hesitated. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." Margaret entered. The attorney greeted her politely. She placed Daniel's document on the table. "Before anyone signs anything, I think everyone needs to understand what Daniel actually established." Ethan looked at the paper. "What is that?" "Your father's final instruction." His expression changed. "You never showed me this." "I didn't know about it until yesterday." "Who told you?" "Robert." Ethan leaned back. "Why didn't Dad tell me?" "I don't know." "That doesn't make sense." Margaret looked directly at him. "Your father didn't want to control you." "Then why did he create all these restrictions?" "Because he knew you were under financial pressure." Ethan's face went pale. Victoria looked at him. "What does that mean?" Margaret did not answer for him. Ethan looked down. His attorney spoke carefully. "Ethan, I think you should explain your current financial position." Ethan shook his head. "This isn't necessary." "It is," the attorney said. Victoria looked confused. "What is going on?" Ethan remained silent. Margaret suddenly understood something. Victoria might not know about the debt. Perhaps Ethan had never told her the full truth. The attorney continued. "Before we discuss changes to the trust, we need to understand the financial obligations you currently have." Ethan stood. "I don't want to do this here." His attorney remained calm. "Then we shouldn't proceed with the transfer." Victoria looked at Ethan. "You told me everything was fine." "It is fine." "Then why are they asking about debt?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because my mother wants to make me look irresponsible." Margaret felt the familiar sting. But this time she didn't react. She reached into her purse and removed Daniel's letter. "I don't want to make you look like anything." She placed it on the table. "Your father did." Ethan stared at the letter. "He wrote this before he died." "I know. He knew this could happen." Ethan picked it up. His hands were shaking. He read silently. Victoria moved closer. "What does it say?" Ethan didn't answer. He continued reading. Margaret watched him. For the first time in months, she saw uncertainty in his eyes. Not anger. Not certainty. Uncertainty. When he finished, he placed the letter on the table. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret's voice softened. "Because I didn't know." "You knew Dad had a trust." "I learned about it yesterday." "You're lying." The accusation came quickly. Margaret looked hurt. But she stayed calm. "I have no reason to lie to you." Ethan pushed the chair back. "This is unbelievable." Victoria stepped between them. "Ethan, let's go." He looked at her. "No." Victoria stopped. "I need to understand this." Ethan looked at his attorney. "Do I really have that much debt?" The attorney answered carefully. "You need to review your financial records before we discuss that." Victoria looked at Ethan. "Is there something you're not telling me?" He didn't answer. That silence was enough. Victoria's face changed. Margaret felt sorry for her. Not because Victoria had been kind to her. She hadn't. But because Margaret knew what it felt like to discover that someone you loved had hidden something important. The attorney suggested that everyone take a break. Ethan walked outside. Victoria followed him. Margaret stayed behind. She sat alone in the conference room. Through the glass wall, she could see Ethan and Victoria talking in the hallway. Victoria's arms were crossed. Ethan was speaking quickly. Then Victoria turned away. Margaret couldn't hear their words. She didn't need to. Whatever had been happening between them, the foundation was beginning to crack. After several minutes, Ethan came back inside alone. He sat across from his mother. Neither spoke. Finally he said, "I have debt." Margaret nodded. "How much?" "I don't know exactly." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was embarrassed." Margaret felt her anger disappear. She saw her son again. Not the man who had threatened her. Not the husband defending his wife. Just Ethan. The boy who had once hidden a broken lamp because he was afraid she would be disappointed. She leaned forward. You never had to be ashamed with me. He looked down. I thought Dad would think I was a failure. He never did. You don't know that. Ido. How? Margaret touched the letter. Because he wrote it. Ethan looked at the paper. Then he asked the question she had been waiting for. Did Dad think Victoria was bad for me? Margaret shook her head. No. Then what did he think? That you needed to learn the difference between protecting someone and surrendering your judgment to them. Ethan looked away. For a long time he said nothing. Then Victoria entered the room. Her eyes were red. She looked at Ethan. Why didn't you tell me? Ethan stood. I was going to. When? I don't know. Victoria shook her head. I thought we were building our future together. We are. Then why did you let me believe we were in a better financial position than we were? I was trying to fix it. By taking your mother's assets? Ethan looked at Margaret. He didn't answer. Victoria's expression hardened. Is that what this was? No. Then what was it? Ethan struggled to find the words. I thought if we had access to Dad's money, everything would be easier. Margaret spoke gently. Ethan, that's exactly why your father created the trust. He looked at her. She continued. He wasn't trying to keep money from you. He was trying to keep me from using it badly. Yes. Ethan lowered his head. The meeting ended without anyone signing anything. For the first time since the conflict began, Margaret did not feel like she had won. She felt exhausted. Outside the building, Ethan walked beside her. Victoria had left separately. The silence between mother and son lasted almost an entire block. Finally Ethan spoke. Mom. Yes. I don't know what to do. Margaret looked at him. You don't have to decide today. I think I've made everything worse. You have. He looked wounded. Margaret softened. But making things worse doesn't mean you can't make them better. He nodded. Then he asked, do you hate Victoria? Margaret almost smiled. No. After everything? I don't hate her. Why? Because if I spend my life blaming her for every choice you make, I'll never see you as an adult. Ethan looked at his mother. That sentence stayed with him. Before they reached the parking lot, his phone rang. It was Victoria. Ethan answered. He listened. His expression changed. Where are you? A pause. Then he said, I'll come home. He hung up. Margaret watched him. What happened? Ethan shook his head. I don't know. He looked frightened. What is it? Victoria found another document. What document? I don't know. Margaret's stomach tightened. Where? She says it was in the file from the attorney. Margaret stared at him. What does it say? Ethan looked at her. She said it has Dad's name on it. For a moment neither moved. Margaret thought of the letter. The trust. The hidden financial problems. The years of silence. Then Ethan said something that made her blood run cold. Mom, Victoria says Dad may have known about my debt before I did. Margaret shook her head. That isn't possible. Ethan looked at her. Then why would he leave a note about it? Margaret had no answer. And suddenly, the mystery surrounding Daniel's final months seemed much larger than either of them had imagined. There was still one document they hadn't seen. One piece of evidence that could explain why Daniel had been so concerned. And if Victoria was telling the truth, the secret had been buried long before Daniel died. Margaret looked at her son. For the first time in months, they were standing on the same side of a question. They both wanted the same answer. What had Daniel discovered before he died? Neither of them knew that finding that answer would force Ethan to confront a painful truth about his father, and an even more painful truth about himself. By the time Ethan and Margaret reached the parking lot, the rain had started again. Neither of them moved toward their cars. They stood beneath the narrow awning outside the law office, listening to the rain strike the pavement. Ethan looked at his phone. Victoria says she found the document in the folder her attorney gave her. What kind of document? She wouldn't tell me over the phone. Margaret frowned. Then we shouldn't assume anything. I know. But Ethan didn't sound convinced. He looked exhausted. For the first time in weeks, Margaret noticed how much weight he seemed to have lost. His shoulders were tense. His eyes were tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying a secret for too long. Mom, he said quietly, what if Dad knew everything? Margaret shook her head. Then we'll find out what he knew. And what if he knew I was in debt? He probably did. Ethan looked at her sharply. How can you say that? Because your father kept records. And because Robert told me Daniel had been concerned about your finances. Ethan looked away. I thought he was disappointed in me. He wasn't. How do you know? Because he never stopped believing in you. Ethan was silent. Then his phone rang again. Victoria. He answered. What? Margaret couldn't hear her words. Ethan's expression slowly changed. All right. A pause. Don't touch anything until I get there. He hung up. What happened? Margaret asked. She found another letter. From your father? Yes. What does it say? She says it mentions money transferred from one of Dad's accounts. Margaret's heart tightened. That doesn't make sense. That's what I thought. Where is she? At home. Ethan looked at his mother. Will you come with me? Margaret hesitated. She wanted to say no. She knew she should stay out of their marriage. But this was no longer simply a marital disagreement. This involved Daniel's estate. And possibly a financial decision that could affect Ethan and his unborn child. All right, she said. They drove separately. Margaret followed Ethan through the wet streets. When they arrived at Ethan and Victoria's house, Victoria was waiting near the front door. She looked frightened. That immediately caught Margaret's attention. Victoria was usually composed. Today she wasn't. She held a single sheet of paper in her hand. Where did you find it? Ethan asked. In the bottom of the folder. Which folder? The documents your mother brought to the attorney. Margaret looked at the page. May I see it? Victoria handed it to her. Margaret recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. Her hands went cold. It wasn't a letter. It was a handwritten financial note. There were dates, account numbers, amounts, and one sentence that made Margaret stop breathing for a moment. If Ethan ever asks for unrestricted access, review the transfers made during the previous 3 years before approving anything. Margaret looked at Ethan. What transfers? I don't know. Victoria stepped closer. There are several payments listed here. Margaret read them carefully. The amounts weren't enormous individually. $5,000, $8,000, $12,000. Several smaller transfers. They had been made from one of Daniel's business accounts before his death. Ethan looked confused. Where did that money go? Margaret looked at the dates. Some of them were familiar. One transfer had happened shortly after Ethan had started his first business venture. Another had occurred after he had purchased his house. Margaret looked at her son. Did Dad ever give you money? Ethan frowned. Not directly. Think carefully. He stared at the page. I remember he helped me with the down payment. Margaret nodded. How much? I thought it was a gift. Did he tell you that? I don't remember. Victoria looked at Ethan. How much? Ethan hesitated. About $30,000. Margaret looked back at the document. The amount was close, but not exact. There were several transfers. Robert had told her Daniel kept records. Now she understood why. He had been documenting financial assistance to Ethan. Not to punish him. To make sure there was a clear record of what had been given. Victoria suddenly spoke. So the money wasn't missing. Margaret shook her head. No. Then why did Daniel write that we should review it? Margaret didn't know. She turned the page over. There was nothing else. Ethan walked toward the kitchen. I need a drink. Victoria followed him. Margaret stayed in the living room. She noticed a framed photograph on the shelf. It was a wedding picture. Ethan and Victoria smiling. Margaret had been there. She remembered that day. She had been happy. She had believed her son had found someone who would stand beside him for the rest of his life. Now she wasn't sure what to believe. Ethan returned with a glass of water. I'm calling Robert. Margaret nodded. He put the call on speaker. Robert answered. Ethan? Robert, we found a note from Dad. What note? Ethan described it. Robert was silent for several seconds. Where are you? At home. Don't move or sign anything. We're not. Good. Ethan asked. What are those transfers? Robert took a breath. They were payments Daniel made for Ethan. For what? Education. Housing. Business expenses. A few personal emergencies. Ethan looked confused. Why didn't I know about all of them? Because some of them were structured as loans. Ethan's face changed. Loans. Yes. Victoria looked at him. How much do you owe? I don't know. Robert continued. That's the problem. Ethan looked at Margaret. What problem? Daniel didn't want the trust to become a way for you to erase your financial obligations. The room became silent. Ethan sat down. So Dad wasn't trying to punish me? No. He was trying to make sure I learned to manage my own money. Yes. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Then Victoria asked the question nobody had asked yet. What does this have to do with me? Robert paused. Margaret noticed it. What aren't you telling us? Ethan asked. Robert answered carefully. Before Daniel died, he became aware that some of Ethan's financial decisions were being influenced by his relationship. Victoria es diferente. Are you saying I manipulated him? No. But that's what you're implying. No. Robert repeated. I'm saying Daniel wanted Ethan to make financial decisions independently, especially when those decisions could affect his marriage. Ethan looked at Victoria. She looked hurt. I never forced you to do anything, she said. I know. Then why does everyone keep looking at me? Margaret stepped forward. No one is accusing you. Victoria looked at her. You are. I am not. You've thought it from the beginning. Margaret shook her head. I've thought many things, but I don't know the truth. That answer seemed to calm Victoria slightly. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. It was an email from his attorney. He opened it. His face went pale. What? Margaret asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He read the message again. Then he handed the phone to her. The email was brief. The attorney had discovered that one of the documents Ethan had been asked to sign could potentially conflict with the conditions of Daniel's trust. But there was something else. A second paragraph. The attorney had found a previous request for information made by Victoria months earlier. She had asked whether Ethan could obtain early access to the protected assets. Margaret looked at Victoria. Victoria's face went white. I asked a question, she said. Ethan stared at her. You told me you never contacted Dad's attorney. I didn't say that. You said you didn't know anything about the trust. I said I didn't understand it. You knew enough to ask about getting access. Victoria began to cry. I was scared. Of what? That we were going to lose everything. Ethan looked stunned. We weren't. I didn't know that. You should have told me. I tried. When? Victoria wiped her face. When you were already angry with your mother. Ethan looked away. Margaret felt the tension in the room shift. This was no longer a simple story of a manipulative wife and an innocent son. There had been fear, poor decisions, silence, and assumptions on all sides. Then Victoria said something that stopped everyone. There's something else. Ethan turned. What? The document I found wasn't the only thing in the folder. Margaret looked at her. What else? Victoria reached into a drawer and pulled out a second envelope. It has Daniel's name on it. Margaret took it. The envelope was sealed. Her husband's handwriting was on the front. But this time, there were only 3 words. For Ethan only. Ethan stared at it. Open it. Margaret looked at him. You're sure? He nodded. She handed it to him. Ethan opened the envelope. Inside was a short letter. He read it silently. His expression changed. Then he looked at Margaret. Mom. What? His voice broke. Dad knew. Knew what? Ethan handed her the letter. Margaret read the first line. Her heart stopped. Daniel had written that he knew Ethan had borrowed money from someone close to him. Someone he trusted. Someone whose involvement had never been disclosed to Margaret. Margaret looked at Ethan. Who? Ethan couldn't answer. Victoria covered her mouth. Margaret read the final sentence. If you ever believe your mother is standing between you and the life you want, ask yourself who benefits most from your anger. Margaret lowered the letter. No one spoke. For the first time, Ethan seemed to understand what his father had been trying to protect him from. But there was still one question. Who had lent Ethan the money? And why had Daniel believed that person's influence could become dangerous? The answer was closer than any of them expected. And when Ethan finally remembered the name, he looked at Victoria with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Because the person Daniel had been worried about was not a stranger. It was someone already inside their family. Ethan stared at the letter in his mother's hands. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The rain had stopped outside, but the house remained heavy with silence. Margaret looked at her son. Ethan, who did you borrow the money from? He swallowed. I don't know if it matters. It matters if Dad knew about it. Victoria stepped closer. Ethan. He looked at her. I borrowed money from your brother. Victoria froze. My brother? Mark. Margaret felt a strange sense of relief. At least it wasn't a stranger. Then Victoria shook her head. Mark didn't lend you that much money. I know. Then what are you talking about? Ethan looked confused. I thought it came from Mark. Victoria stared at him. It didn't. Margaret looked between them. What do you mean? Victoria sat down. My brother's name was on the account, but the money wasn't his. Ethan frowned. Then whose was it? Victoria looked at Margaret. I didn't know until recently. She took a breath. Dad's. Margaret's face went pale. Daniel. Victoria nadie. Mark helped move the money because Daniel didn't want Ethan to know where it came from. Ethan stared at her. Why would Dad do that? Because you were already in debt, Victoria said. He wanted to help you without making you feel like he was rescuing you. Margaret slowly sat down. Suddenly, the pieces began to fit. The transfers. The loans. The trust. The letter. Daniel had not been preparing to control Ethan. He had been quietly trying to protect him while preserving his dignity. But there was still something Margaret didn't understand. Why didn't Daniel tell me? Victoria answered softly. Because Ethan asked him not to. Margaret looked at her son. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. I was ashamed. Margaret said nothing. I told Dad I didn't want you to know. Why? Because I thought you'd worry. Margaret almost laughed through her tears. I was your mother. I was supposed to worry. Ethan looked down. I know. Then Victoria spoke. There was another reason. Margaret looked at her. What? Victoria hesitated. Daniel was afraid Ethan would depend on the money instead of fixing the problem himself. Margaret nodded slowly. That sounds like him. Ethan picked up the letter again. Then why did Dad write that someone could benefit from my anger? Victoria looked at him. Because he wasn't talking about me. Ethan stared. Who was he talking about? Victoria's voice became quiet. My mother. Margaret frowned. Your mother? Victoria nadie. My mother knew about Ethan's debt. Ethan looked shocked. How? She found out through Mark. Victoria explained that her mother had been struggling financially and had pressured Victoria to convince Ethan to access the family assets sooner. Victoria had been afraid. She had worried that if she refused, her mother would lose her home. So you were trying to get the money for your mother? Ethan asked. Victoria began to cry. Not exactly. What does that mean? I wanted to help her. But I also wanted us to have financial security. I thought if we could access the inheritance, we could solve everyone's problems. Margaret looked at her. And you believed I was the obstacle? Victoria nadie. Yes. Ethan stood and walked toward the window. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he turned around. So Dad wasn't trying to keep me from my wife. No, Margaret said. He was trying to keep me from making decisions because I was under pressure. Yes. And Mom wasn't trying to control me. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. No. Ethan looked at the letter. I betrayed you. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She wanted to tell him everything was fine. She wanted to hug him. But she knew that would make the moment too easy. Instead, she said, "You hurt me." Ethan nodded. "I know. You believe someone else's version of me without asking me for the truth. I know. And you were willing to threaten me with legal action." His face tightened. "I know. Victoria Stuth. I hurt you too." Margaret looked at her. "Yes. Victoria Nariz. I was afraid. But that doesn't excuse what I did." Margaret appreciated the honesty. For the first time, Victoria wasn't defending herself. She was accepting responsibility. Ethan walked toward his mother. "I don't know how to fix this." Margaret looked into his eyes. "You don't fix trust with one apology." "I understand. You rebuild it." He nodded. "How?" "Slowly." Ethan sat beside her. "I'll do that." Margaret placed her hand over his. Not because everything was forgiven. Not because the family was suddenly perfect. But because the door was no longer closed. Robert later confirmed what Daniel had intended. The trust would remain intact. Ethan would not receive unrestricted access to the protected assets until he completed independent financial counseling and resolved his existing debt responsibly. No one was being punished. The safeguards Daniel had created were simply being followed. Victoria agreed to separate her mother's financial problems from Ethan's inheritance. She and Ethan also agreed to meet with a marriage counselor. Not because their marriage was over, but because they needed to learn how to communicate without using fear or family pressure to make financial decisions. Margaret did not move back into their lives immediately. She kept her own home, her own finances, her own boundaries. But Ethan began visiting every Sunday again. At first, the conversations were awkward. Then they became easier. One afternoon, several months later, Ethan sat with Margaret in the kitchen. He looked at the old photograph of his father. "I finally understand what Dad was trying to teach me." Margaret smiled. "What?" "That protecting someone doesn't mean giving them whatever they want." She nodded. "And loving someone doesn't mean letting them make every decision for you." Margaret looked at him. "Your father would have liked that answer." Ethan smiled. "I wish I could tell him." Margaret reached across the table. "You can." He looked at her. "How?" "Live differently." Ethan nodded. For the first time in a long time, Margaret saw peace in her son's face. The inheritance had not saved him. The money had not saved him. His marriage had not saved him. The truth had. And the most painful lesson of all had become the most valuable one. Sometimes the person you think is standing in your way is the person quietly protecting you from a decision you are not yet ready to understand. Margaret had not won because she defeated Victoria. She had won because she refused to become bitter. She protected her boundaries, told the truth, and gave her son enough space to discover the truth for himself. And Ethan finally understood what his father had known all along. Real love does not control you. It teaches you how to stand on your own. **. 6 months after the night everything fell apart. Margaret's house no longer felt as quiet as it once had. Nothing about the house had changed. The same wooden table stood in the kitchen. The same framed photographs lined the hallway. Daniel's old chair still sat beside the window. But something inside Margaret had changed. She no longer looked at that empty chair and felt only loss. Sometimes she still missed him so deeply that she could barely speak. But now when she looked at his photograph, she also felt grateful. He had left her more than memories. He had left her a lesson about love, responsibility, and the difficult difference between protecting someone and controlling them. Ethan had changed too. Not overnight. Not magically. There had been no dramatic apology that erased everything. There had been no single conversation that repaired their relationship. Instead, Ethan came back slowly. Every Sunday he visited his mother. At first, he stayed for less than an hour. They talked about ordinary things. The weather, work, groceries, the repairs Margaret needed around the house. Neither of them mentioned the argument. Neither wanted to force forgiveness before trust had time to return. Then, gradually, the conversations became deeper. Ethan began telling his mother about his finances. Not because she demanded to know. Because he wanted her to know. He had started working with an independent financial advisor, just as Daniel's trust required. He had created a repayment plan for his debts. He had also stopped making financial decisions simply because someone else was afraid. That had been the hardest lesson. He was learning to ask, is this really what I want? Or, am I doing this because I'm afraid of disappointing someone? Victoria was changing too. Their marriage had survived, but it had not returned to the way it was before. They had both realized that their financial conflict had exposed problems that had existed long before Margaret became involved. Victoria admitted that she had allowed fear about her family's financial situation to influence decisions that should have belonged to her and Ethan. Ethan admitted that he had avoided difficult conversations because he wanted everyone to be happy. They both learned that avoiding conflict did not create peace. It only postponed the conflict until it became more painful. They began counseling. It wasn't easy. There were uncomfortable conversations. There were moments when both wanted to walk away. But they stayed. Not because anyone forced them to. Because they wanted to see whether their marriage could become healthier. Margaret respected that decision. She never tried to interfere. That was one of the promises she made to herself. She would never again confuse being a mother with being responsible for every choice her adult son made. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan arrived earlier than usual. He carried a small box. Margaret looked at it. What is that? I found something. He placed the box on the kitchen table. Margaret opened it. Inside was an old photograph of Daniel, Ethan, and Margaret. Ethan was about 10 years old. Daniel was standing behind them with one hand on Ethan's shoulder. Margaret smiled. I haven't seen this in years. I found it in storage. Ethan sat down. I thought you should have it. Margaret held the photograph carefully. He looks happy. He was. They sat quietly. Then Ethan said, Mom, I've been thinking about Dad. Margaret looked at him. About what? About the letter. What about it? I think I finally understand why he didn't tell me everything. Margaret waited. He knew if he gave me all the answers, I would depend on him to make every decision. Margaret nodded. So he left enough information for me to find the answers myself. Yes. Ethan looked at the photograph. He trusted me to learn. Margaret smiled. That was your father. Ethan's eyes became wet. I was so angry with you. I know. I thought you were trying to control my life. I know. I said things I shouldn't have said. Yes. He looked at her. Can you forgive me? Margaret took a long breath. I already have. Ethan looked relieved. But, she continued, forgiveness doesn't mean we pretend it never happened. He nodded. I understand. It means we learn from it. I will. Margaret reached across the table. Ethan took her hand. For a few moments neither spoke. Then Ethan smiled. You know what Dad's greatest gift to me was? What? Not the money. Margaret smiled. What was it? Giving me a reason to become responsible for my own life. Margaret squeezed his hand. And your greatest gift to me? Ethan looked confused. What? You came back. His eyes filled with tears. I was always your son. Margaret smiled. I know. Outside, the afternoon sun moved slowly across the yard. For the first time since Daniel's death, the house felt complete. Not because the past had disappeared. Not because the family had become perfect. But because everyone had finally stopped pretending. Margaret had learned that winning did not mean defeating the people who hurt her. It meant refusing to let their choices destroy the person she wanted to be. She had protected her financial independence. She had maintained the boundaries Daniel had created. She had refused to sign documents under pressure. But she had also refused to turn her pain into revenge. That mattered. Because revenge might have given her satisfaction for a moment. Truth gave her something better. Peace. Before Ethan left that evening, he stopped at the front door. Mom. Yes. I want you to know something. What? If this happens again. Margaret raised an eyebrow. I hope it doesn't. Ethan laughed. Me too. Then his expression became serious. If I ever disagree with you again, I'll talk to you. I won't let someone else tell me what you meant. Margaret smiled. That sounds fair. And if you think I'm making a bad decision, I'll tell you, even if I don't want to hear it. Especially then. He laughed. Okay. He hugged her. Margaret held him tightly. When he walked toward his car, she watched him through the window. She didn't feel afraid anymore. She didn't need to know what decision he would make tomorrow. She didn't need to control his future. She had finally understood what Daniel had tried to teach them both. A parent's job is not to build a cage around a child and call it protection. It is to give that child the strength to walk away from the cage. And sometimes, when that child is grown, the greatest act of love is simply standing nearby and trusting him to find his own way. Margaret turned back toward the kitchen. Daniel's photograph was still on the mantel. She walked over and touched the frame. "Thank you," she whispered. There was no answer. There didn't need to be. She already knew what he would have said. "Take care of yourself." So she did. And somewhere between grief and forgiveness, Margaret finally understood that she had not lost her family. She had simply lost the version of it built on fear, silence, and misunderstanding. What remained was smaller, quieter. But it was real. And for the first time in years, that was enough.